The night had fallen over Belle Rive like a shroud, thick with humidity and the smell of rain that had yet to fall. The plantation's fields glistened faintly under a crescent moon, each stalk of sugarcane swaying in a rhythm too slow to be peaceful. From the veranda of the great house, the bayou whispered. Even the frogs had quieted, as though they, too, were waiting. Inside, every candle burned low. Eveline Rousseau stood by the window in her silk gown, her reflection split by the pane's imperfect glass. Beyond it, the yard spread wide and silent, no movement except for the lanterns flickering by the old quarters. She should have felt secure behind her locked doors and polished floors, but instead she felt the house breathing against her, restless as a trapped soul. Each year, when the summer reached its heaviest heat, this night returned. It was called the Night of Selection, a relic of her late husband's rule, a ritual of control disguised as inspection. She had never believed in its necessity, yet each time she told herself she would end it, the pressure of the estate, the eyes of overseers and neighboring planters, reminded her that weakness in a Rousseau would draw blood. Tonight, for the first time, she would oversee it alone. She reached for the ribbon at her wrist, tightening it until her pulse quickened. Her father's old watch, gold and heavy, marked the minutes in silence. 9:10. By now, they would be gathering outside the carriage house, waiting for her signal. The thought of it filled her with a mixture of dread and obligation, a kind of trembling that came not from fear of others, but of herself. Down below, in the dim of the quarters, Samuel bent over a bucket of water, splashing his face in the dark. His reflection rippled and vanished, leaving only the shimmer of a lantern's flame beside him. The air was so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Around him, men spoke in whispers, voices brittle as the cane stalks outside. "They say she don't look 'em in the eye." One murmured, "Don't matter." Another replied, "Eye or no eye, she sees what she wants." Samuel said nothing. He had worked the fields of Belle Rive since he could walk, seen 3 owners come and go, and learned that silence could be armor. But tonight felt different. There was a tension that carried through the soil itself, like the earth remembered something terrible that the people had tried to forget. He heard the creak of boots outside, the overseer, Thaddeus Crane, tall, with eyes pale as winter. Crane's voice cut through the murmurs. "Line up, now." The men obeyed, stepping into the humid night. The sky pressed low, silver clouds dragging over the moon. Samuel joined the line, his jaw set, the lanterns along the yard throwing long shadows that reached the veranda steps. Inside, Eveline placed her hand on the banister. She paused to steady herself, then began the slow descent, each step echoing faintly through the hall. Her dress rustled against the polished wood, and for a moment she caught her own reflection again. In the mirrors lining the corridor, in the gleam of the floor, in the faint tremor of her hand. When she stepped outside, the air hit her like a wall. The overseer bowed slightly, his hat in hand. "They're ready, ma'am." She nodded. "Proceed." Her voice carried no warmth, no hesitation. Yet inside her chest, her heartbeat was sharp and fast. She looked over the row of men, faces glistening with sweat, eyes averted. The lanterns made them appear carved from bronze and shadow, every line of muscle etched by work and exhaustion. Crane began reading names from a list, his tone mechanical. Eveline watched, noting not their strength or stature, but their silence. There was power in quiet, more dangerous than anger. Samuel's name was near the end. When it was spoken, he stepped forward, meeting her gaze for the briefest moment before lowering it. She froze. There was something in that fraction of a second, an awareness, perhaps even defiance, that unsettled her. She gestured slightly to Crane, "This one, bring him to the main house." Samuel's stomach tightened. Around him, the others shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. He felt the overseer's hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. The walk up to the veranda felt endless, each board creaking beneath his bare feet. The door loomed open, and inside the hall smelled of cedar and candle smoke. Eveline followed, her steps measured. The sound of the door closing behind them sealed the air like a vault. "Wait here," she told Crane. Then, turning to Samuel, "Follow." He obeyed, eyes darting to the portraits that lined the corridor, stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes following him. She led him into the old library where dust danced in the candlelight. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of spilled ink or dried blood. "Do you know why you were brought here?" she asked quietly. Samuel shook his head. "No, ma'am." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, then drifted to the shelves. "This house was built on rules," she said, almost to herself. "Rules my husband believed could keep order, but rules are like chains. They rust, they break, and when they do, all that's left is the noise they made." He didn't answer. The candles flickered. A storm was gathering outside. Thunder rolled softly through the distant hills. She turned toward him, studying his face. "You've worked here long." "Yes, ma'am, since I was small." She nodded once. "And you remember him, my husband?" Samuel hesitated. "Yes, ma'am, I remember. He believed fear could hold this place together," she said. "But I see what fear does. It eats from the inside." The storm cracked. Lightning spilled across the windows. For an instant both their faces lit white, mirrored in the glass. When the darkness returned, the silence felt heavier. Outside the room, Crane shifted uneasily. He didn't like when she dismissed him. The mistress had changed since her husband's death. Too quiet, too thoughtful. He had seen the ledgers. The estate was running thin. Something would give soon. Inside, Eveline stepped closer to the window. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Ain't no place to go." "Maybe there is," she murmured. "Maybe just not for me." He frowned slightly, unsure what she meant. Her voice had softened, as though she were speaking to herself. Then she turned abruptly, her composure returning like a mask slipping back into place. "You may go," she said. "Tell Mr. Crane to send the next." Samuel hesitated, then bowed his head and stepped out. As the door closed behind him, Eveline let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the quick beat of her heart. What had she seen in that man's eyes? Pity, judgment, or the reflection of something she no longer wanted to face? The thunder grew louder. Somewhere deep in the house, a shutter slammed open. Eveline turned sharply, her pulse jumping. She walked into the corridor, calling for the servants, but no answer came. The hall stretched long and dim, the candlelight flickering as though stirred by invisible breath. Then she saw it, a shape moving at the far end, too quick to name, gone before she could call out. The storm howled through the chimney. For a moment she thought she heard whispering, a man's voice, low, almost pleading. Her hand went to the ribbon at her wrist again, pulling it tighter until her fingers ached. When Crane returned, she was standing by the grand mirror, staring at herself as if trying to recognize the person in the reflection. "Ma'am," he said softly. She didn't look at him. "Cancel the rest. The selection is over." "But do it." Crane hesitated, then bowed and left. Outside, Samuel walked back toward the quarters, the rain beginning to fall. Each drop hissed on the warm earth. He glanced once over his shoulder at the great house, where the last lantern still burned in the upper window. He couldn't name it, but something had shifted to night, something deeper than orders or rituals. The air felt charged, the kind of stillness that came before change. And far above, behind her shuttered window, Eveline Rousseau watched the storm roll in, wondering whether the chains that bound others had, all along, been binding her too. The storm came down upon Belrive before midnight. It began as a whisper against the shutters, then rose into a rolling, endless roar that swallowed the bayou's night sounds. Rain lashed the veranda, streaking through the lantern light until everything beyond the windows blurred into liquid silver. Inside the house, the air felt charged, every wall trembling as thunder crawled through its bones. Eveline Rousseau sat alone in the library where she had spoken to Samuel only hours before. The candles had burned low. Wax pooled and hardened on the oak table like frozen tears. Each flash of lightning revealed the portraits on the wall, faces of Rousseau's long dead, pale and watching. She had covered one earlier that evening, her late husband's, but the cloth stirred in the draught, showing his painted eyes whenever the wind shifted. She pressed her fingers to her temples. The house had too many memories, too many voices that did not belong to the living. Since the selection had ended, something inside her had broken its stillness. The silence she had once ruled with now seemed like a punishment. The storm outside only mirrored what had begun to stir within. In the quarters, Samuel lay awake. The roof leaked where the beams had warped, letting thin streams of rain drip down. Each drop struck the dirt floor with a slow rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. The men around him were quiet, most pretending to sleep, some whispering prayers. But Samuel's thoughts were fixed on the house up the hill. He could still see the look on the mistress's face when she had dismissed him. It wasn't cruelty he had seen. It was confusion, fear even, and that unsettled him more than any threat could. Another crash of thunder made the windows shiver. The door of the quarters burst open, and a gust of rain swept in. Martha, one of the older women who worked in the kitchen, called out, "Storm's pulling down the west fence. They'll be calling for help before dawn." No one moved. They knew the overseer would handle it, and that he'd handle anyone who interfered. But Samuel couldn't shake the thought that something in that big house was breaking too, something no fence could hold back. He pulled his blanket tighter, listening to the wind shriek through the cane fields. Back in the mansion, Eveline rose and crossed to the tall window. She unlatched it on impulse. The rain struck her face like needles, the air thick and cold. Below, the yard was a sea of mud and moving shadows, branches, furniture covers. The remains of a garden chair swept across the ground. She could smell the sugarcane crushed under the storm's weight, sweet and bitter all at once. A sudden knock echoed from the corridor. She turned sharply, heart racing. When the door opened, it was only Thaddeus Crane, hat dripping, coat dark with rain. He stepped in without invitation. "Fence is down by the creek," he said. "Lost 2 posts. Told the hands to tie it till morning." She nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Crane." He studied her for a moment. "Begging pardon, ma'am, but this house ain't safe for you alone in a storm like this. I can have someone keep watch." "I don't need guarding," she replied. Her tone was calm, but her fingers trembled around the window latch. Crane's eyes flicked to the portrait behind her. "Your husband used to walk these halls on nights like this," said the rain kept him honest. Eveline's voice dropped. "My husband is dead, Mr. Crane, and honesty was never his virtue." The overseer gave a thin smile. "If you say so, ma'am." He touched his hat and left, his boots echoing down the hall. When he was gone, Eveline locked the door. Her pulse was still high. She hated the way Crane looked at her as if she were part of the property, something to be measured and managed. The storm howled louder. Lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw a figure move across the far end of the veranda, a darker shadow against the night. She blinked, and it was gone. In the quarters, Samuel finally sat up. The wind had changed direction, carrying with it a distant cry, metal against metal. Maybe a door blown open, maybe something worse. He pulled on his shirt and stepped outside. Rain hit him full in the face, but he kept moving, following the faint glow that marked the house above. Halfway up the slope, his foot slipped in the mud. He caught himself on a fence post that leaned at a crooked angle. For a moment he thought of turning back, but then he saw light flickering in one of the upper windows, the mistress's room. He thought, and something in him refused to ignore it. Inside, Eveline was trying to relight a candle when the window slammed open again. The gust snuffed the flame and hurled rain across the floor. She reached for the shutter, but a hand caught it from outside and held it steady. Startled, she leaned forward and saw Samuel, drenched, eyes wide in the lightning's glare. "Ma'am," he shouted above the wind, the storms tearing through the south wall, "you need to move away from the window." She stepped back, stunned that he had come. "Get inside," she called. He climbed through the window with the grace of someone long used to climbing. Rain streamed from his hair, pooling on the rug. For a long second neither spoke. The house groaned under the storm's weight, timbers creaking like old bones. "I told Crane the same," she said quietly. "He doesn't listen." "Crane listens to what suits him," Samuel replied. His tone held no insolence, only truth. She looked at him, seeing not the worker from the fields but a man who had come back into the fire instead of running from it. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. He glanced toward the door. "Neither should you, ma'am. The east wall's flooding. Basement'll go next." Thunder cracked so close that the whole room flared white. When it faded, the sound of splintering wood filled the silence. Somewhere below them, a shutter tore free. Eveline's breath caught. "Follow me," she said. She led him through the corridor toward the main staircase. Water dripped from the ceiling. Each step felt alive beneath their feet, shaking with every gust. In the grand hall, the chandeliers swayed like pendulums. Samuel grabbed one of the posts as another flash of light cut through the windows. The glass rattled but held. They reached the lower floor. The servants' doors were locked. The key hung from a hook high above. Eveline reached for it, her hand brushing Samuel's for an instant before she pulled away. She turned the lock and the heavy door opened to the courtyard. Rain and wind rushed in. "Go," she said. "Get back to the quarters. Tell them to stay clear of the creek." He hesitated. "What about you? I'll see to the house." But even as she said it, part of the roof groaned ominously above them. Samuel stepped forward. "Ma'am, if that beam goes, you won't make it out alone." She looked up the staircase, shadows rippling like ghosts along the walls. For a heartbeat, she heard her husband's voice, or thought she did, whispering her name through the thunder. Then the ceiling cracked. Samuel moved without thinking, pulling her aside as a chunk of plaster crashed down where she had stood. Dust and rain filled the air. Eveline coughed, eyes watering. When the noise faded, she realized he still had his arm around her, steadying her. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once and stepped back. The storm outside was already easing the worst of it, moving toward the river, but the house still trembled, as though unwilling to release the fear it had stored. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Eveline spoke again, her voice low. "There are papers in my husband's study ledgers, deeds. If anything happens to me, burn them." Samuel frowned. "Why would you trust me with that?" "Because you were the only one who came back," she said. Lightning flared one last time, illuminating both faces, her pale and determined, his dark and watchful before the night swallowed them again. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. The storm had broken, but the air still crackled with what it had left behind. A sense that something buried was about to surface, and that Belrive would never sleep as quietly again. Dawn crept over Belrive as a pale, bruised light. The storm had passed, but its ruin lingered in the broken branches and flooded ditches. The fields steamed beneath the first touch of sun, and from a distance the mansion looked almost peaceful again, if one did not see the shattered shutters or hear the groan of beams settling under their own weight. Eveline Rousseau had not slept. She sat at her writing desk, the hem of her gown damp with rainwater that had seeped up from the carpet. Her fingers moved mechanically over the pages of an old ledger, tracing columns of names and numbers written in her late husband's hand. Some lines were smudged, others crossed through, but what caught her eye were the marks in the margins, tiny strokes of ink shaped like initials, repeated over and over beside certain entries. It was as if someone had been keeping count of something that should never have been recorded. Outside, the voices of the field hands began to rise, tentative, subdued, like sound returning to a world that had almost drowned. Eveline closed the ledger. The house smelled of wet wood and smoke from the fireplaces they had lit to drive out the damp. Somewhere below, she heard Mr. Crane's voice shouting orders, followed by the crack of his cane against the porch rail. The routine of authority was reforming itself, piece by piece, but she felt no comfort in it. At the same hour, Samuel was hauling debris from the creek. The fence had collapsed entirely, and the current carried splinters down toward the swamp. Each time he bent to lift a branch, he felt the ache of exhaustion from the night before. Yet beneath that fatigue was something sharper, a question that refused to settle. Why had she told him to burn the papers, and what exactly did those ledgers hide? He worked until the sun climbed higher, then set the shovel aside and made his way toward the smokehouse, pretending to look for tools. From there, he could see part of the main house through the magnolias. The windows were open now, curtains fluttering like flags of surrender. He noticed the shadow of someone pacing in the study. A voice startled him. "Boy, you done with that fence." Crane stood behind him, mud up to his boots, his expression sharp as a blade. "Almost, sir," Samuel answered. Crane's pale eyes narrowed. "Mistress says she wants the ledgers moved to the parlor. You'll help me fetch them now." Samuel's stomach tightened. He followed the overseer up the hill, the air thick with the scent of churned earth. Inside the library, Eveline was already waiting. Her posture was composed, but her hands were clasped too tightly before her. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you may leave the books here once they're brought down. I'll review them myself." "With respect, ma'am." Crane replied, "These are estate records. They concern the running of the place. My duties to oversee, and mine," she interrupted, "is to decide who oversees what. That will be all." Crane's jaw flexed. He tipped his hat but did not bow. As he turned to leave, his eyes flicked toward Samuel, lingering a beat too long. Then he was gone, the sound of his boots fading down the hall. Eveline waited until the silence settled again before she spoke. "Close the door." Samuel did as she asked. She gestured to the stack of ledgers. "These belong to my husband. He kept them locked for years. I found the key after the funeral." He said nothing. "I thought they held debts, shipments, accounts, but there's more. Look here." She opened one book and turned it toward him. Beside a list of supplies were faint notes written in another hand, dates, initials, and strange symbols, like tallies made during sleepless nights. "I believe he recorded people, not goods," she whispered. "Transfers, sales that were never declared." Samuel's throat tightened. "You mean yes," she said quickly, "but some of these names, they weren't on any registry, they were from here. My husband sold those he claimed were dead or gone." Rainwater still dripped somewhere inside the walls, a slow tapping that marked the seconds. Samuel's hands curled into fists before he could stop them. "Why show me this, ma'am?" "Because I can't trust Crane, and because if these books survive, they'll destroy every soul tied to this land, including me." She turned toward the hearth where a small fire still burned, its embers red and patient. The storm had left a pile of damp wood beside it, refusing to catch flame. "He kept one ledger hidden," she said, "the last. I think Crane knows where it is." Samuel looked at the shelves. "You want me to find it?" She hesitated. "If you can," quietly. He met her eyes for the first time since the night before. "And when I do, then we burn it together." The promise hung between them, fragile as the morning light. By afternoon, the sun returned, harsh and white. The plantation stirred into motion. Repairs, orders, the endless rhythm that disguised fear as normalcy. But the storm had changed the shape of everything. Where the earth had flooded, bones surfaced in the soft soil, small, unmarked, the remains of something buried long ago. Children in the field found them first, their shouts carrying to the porch. Crane ordered silence, quick and cold, but the rumor spread faster than he could stamp it out. Eveline heard of it before dusk. She came down to the field alone, ignoring his protest. The workers parted as she approached, uncertain whether to bow or flee. She knelt in the mud, brushing soil from one pale fragment, her breath catching. It was a jawbone, no larger than her hand. Crane stood behind her. "Storm unearthed the old burial ground," he said flatly. "Best to fill it over before the men get ideas." Eveline didn't answer. The bone felt warm against her palm, though the earth was cold. She looked up at Crane. "You knew this was here." He shrugged. "All lands got history, ma'am." "History," she said softly, "is written by the ones who bury it." When she rose, her dress was streaked with mud, but her expression had changed. Something had hardened in it. She turned toward the house without another word. Samuel watched her from the rows of cane, feeling the weight of what neither could yet name. That night, long after the fires were doused and the frogs began their song again, a faint glow flickered in the library. Eveline stood before the hearth, one of the ledgers open in her hands. She tore a page free, fed it to the flame, and whispered the names she could still read until the ink curled into smoke. But even as the paper burned, she sensed that the truth would not die so easily. Somewhere beyond the window, Samuel moved through the darkness, searching for the hidden book that would prove every secret she feared. And above them both, the mansion creaked, as though the storm had never truly left, its wind still caught in the rafters, waiting for another night to break again. The night came heavy and thick, wrapping Belle Rive like a shroud. The cicadas had not returned since the storm, leaving the air too quiet, quiet enough that every footstep, every whisper of wood, seemed louder than it should. Samuel moved through the corridor with slow, careful steps, counting each board that groaned beneath his weight. He had waited until the mansion slept, or seemed to. The lamps in the hall were dim, the walls damp with shadow, and the house felt alive in its silence, watching. The hidden ledger, Crane had mentioned it once. By accident, Samuel now realized, when he thought no one was listening, in the place where the house remembers. He had said, at the time, it made no sense. But now, after the bones in the field, after the ledger burned page by page in the parlor fireplace, Samuel understood. Some houses remembered in their stones. Belle Rive remembered in the rot beneath its skin. He stopped outside the study. The door was closed, but the lock was nothing more than a brass latch. He eased it open and stepped inside. The room smelled of wet tobacco, old books, and something faintly metallic, like rust that was not rust at all. The floorboards near the hearth were uneven. He knelt, ran his hand along the seams, tapped once, hollow. The sound was small, but it traveled up the walls, through the bones of the house. He worked his fingers beneath the plank and lifted. Dust rose in a pale cloud, and there, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger. He exhaled slowly. The book felt heavy, not with pages but with consequence. He stood to leave, but froze. There was someone in the doorway. Not Crane, not Eveline, a woman, one of the older field women, wrapped in linen, her face half hidden in shadow. Her eyes were dark and still, like deep river water. "You shouldn't touch that," she whispered. Samuel did not drop the ledger, but his grip tightened. "I know what it is," he said. She shook her head once. "You know what it holds, not what it means." Her gaze drifted to the floor, where the plank lay open like a wound. Then to the window, where the branches scratched softly against the glass. "This land keeps its dead close," she murmured, "and the dead don't like being stirred." Before he could speak, she turned and slipped back into the hall, silent, as though the house had swallowed her. Samuel waited, listened, but the corridor was empty. He tucked the ledger inside his shirt and left the study, closing the door, resetting every detail exactly as it was. The mansion seemed to breathe around him. It knew. Eveline waited in her room, candle burning low, hands trembling in her lap. She heard footsteps outside her door, and for an instant fear flared sharp as a blade. The knock came soft. She opened the door. Samuel stood there. His chest rose with careful breaths. He did not look triumphant. He looked burdened. He held out the ledger. Her pulse quickened. Together, they moved to the small round table by the window. The pages were stiff, edges stained, corners worn. She opened it, and the room changed. The air seemed to thicken. The candle flame leaned as if pulled by an unseen wind. Names, dates, not just sales. Transfers, disappearing lines marked not with numbers but symbols. Some names were crossed through entirely. No destination. Only a mark beside them, a shape like a circle broken at one side. Eveline's hand flew to her mouth. Samuel stared, jaw clenched. "These weren't sold," he said. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. "They were taken." Eveline looked up at him, her eyes bright, not with tears but with something hotter. My husband, she whispered, was not the man I believed. A floorboard creaked in the hall, footsteps slow approaching. Samuel snapped the ledger shut. Eveline blew out the candle. Darkness swallowed the room. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence, then a fingertip dragging slowly along the wood. A message, a warning, a promise. Samuel did not breathe. Eveline did not move. Crane's voice came through the door, soft, almost gentle. "Ma'am, we'll need to talk in the morning." The steps receded. The house exhaled, but neither of them did, because now the truth was no longer buried. It was awake. The night felt heavier than the storm had. No wind, no rain, just stillness, thick and unmoving, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Belrive was quiet, but not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of watching. Eveline stood beside the window, looking out over the fields where the moonlight lay in pale stripes. Her reflection in the glass looked ghostly, white-faced, eyes shadowed, not the woman she had once been, but someone thinning under the weight of secrets. Samuel remained in the corner of the room, one hand resting on the ledger now hidden inside a folded cloth. Neither of them spoke for long minutes. The silence between them had shape, volume, pressure. It could be felt. Finally, Eveline broke it. "He knows." Samuel's head lifted. His voice was low, rough. "Crane." She nodded. He was outside the door earlier, not listening, waiting, measuring. Samuel exhaled slowly. "If he knows about the ledger, he doesn't know everything," Eveline said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Samuel stepped closer, not too close, just enough that his presence steadied the room. "What does Crane want?" Eveline looked back out the window, her fingers tightening around the windowsill. "Control. He always wanted it. My husband allowed him too much power. He oversaw more than the fields. He oversaw." Silence. Samuel's jaw tensed. "If your husband was selling his own people off the books, he was," she interrupted. "But Crane arranged it. He chose who vanished. He made the ledgers." The house creaked, not loud, but deliberate, as if something shifted inside the walls. Samuel turned his head sharply, listening. Eveline's eyes followed his, though she saw nothing. "This place," Samuel said quietly, "hears things." Eveline did not disagree. The next morning, the land was drenched in sunlight, so bright it seemed indecent after so much gloom. Workers moved slowly, cautiously. The bones found in the field had not been spoken of aloud since. They did not need to be. Fear traveled without sound. Crane stood on the porch, his boots polished, his posture crisp. His cane tapped rhythmically against the railing. His eyes tracked everything, the fields, the barn, the house. And when she finally stepped outside, "Eveline, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, though his tone was anything but respectful. "Mornin'." She did not slow her stride. "Mr. Crane, storms left a deal of work." Crane continued, "Might be time we reorganize. Leadership." Samuel, who had been carrying sacks toward the shed, stopped mid-step. Crane's gaze slid to him, slow, deliberate, assessing. Eveline's voice remained level. "And who, Mr. Crane, do you believe is in charge here?" Crane's smile was thin, serpentine. "I suppose we'll see." His cane tapped once on the porch. A signal, a warning. Samuel moved on, but his pulse hammered. Crane had spoken without speaking. Lines had been drawn. No room now for mistakes. That evening, Eveline sent Samuel to the library. "The ledger must be hidden again," she told him. "Somewhere Crane will not think to look." The library smelled of old paper and damp stone. The storm had left mildew creeping up the spines of books. Samuel knelt near the bookshelf, checking for loose backing. His hands were steady, though the rest of him was not. A soft knock came at the doorframe. He turned, or froze more than turned. It was the same old woman he had seen the night before. Her eyes held something ancient, something that had seen too much and learned to speak very little. "You found the book," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Samuel replied. "You think this house forgets?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "This land has memory, and memory has teeth." Samuel swallowed. "What do you mean? Names taken do not sleep quiet," she murmured. "Not when the ledger still calls them." Samuel looked down at the wrapped book. The cloth suddenly felt warm, too warm. The woman pointed to the hearth. "You burn it," she said softly, "or it burns you." Then she was gone again, leaving no sound behind her, not even footsteps. Samuel stared at the flames flickering behind the iron grate. He could burn it now. He could end the curse of it, but if he burned it, there would be no proof, no justice, and Evelyn, what would she become without truth to hold? He closed his eyes. No one should have to choose between survival and truth. Yet here that was the only choice. Night again. The moon was gone now, hidden behind clouds. Samuel returned to Eveline's room. She sat at her desk, hands still, posture tense. He placed the ledger on the table. "I didn't burn it," he said. Her eyes closed briefly, not in disappointment, but in acceptance of the path now chosen. "Then we fight." A sound rose from the hallway. A door opened, closed, slow, deliberate. Crane, Eveline, and Samuel did not speak. They did not move. They did not breathe loudly, because now it was clear the house was no longer divided. It had sides, and the walls themselves seemed to lean in, listening. Morning came with a copper sky, red at the edges, like something cauterized, not healed. The fields glistened with dew, but the air was wrong, too still, too sharp, the kind of air that arrives before something breaks. Crane was already outside, not watching the workers, watching the house. His cane tapped rhythmically on the porch rail. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 again, a signal, not to the people, to himself. A reminder that patience is a blade sharpened quietly. Eveline came down the steps, composed and pale. Samuel walked a short distance behind her, carrying nothing, though his posture said he was ready to move if needed. Their presence together was not subtle. Crane noticed. "Ma'am," he greeted, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Fine morning." Eveline met his gaze evenly. "It will be," she answered, "once the work begins." Crane's smile did not touch his eyes. "Oh, the work's begun already." He stepped aside. 2 new men stood behind him, strangers, hard-dyed, not farm hands, not neighbors, men who listened only to money. Eveline's fingers tightened on the railing. Samuel's breath slowed. Crane's voice was smooth as river. "Mud, plantation's been in disarray, ma'am. Thought it wise to bring on extra help, men who understand order. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a move." The first open move. Eveline spoke without turning. "Samuel, come with me." They walked back inside. Once the door shut, her voice trembled. Not from fear, but from fury held too tightly. "He's bringing in outside force." Samuel nodded. "He's preparing to take the house." Eveline moved toward the study, her steps quick, decisive. "No, he will not." But when they reached the study doors, they were already open, drawers pulled, cabinets emptied. Books scattered like wounded birds across the floor, and on the desk the ledgers, all of them, laid out in a neat, deliberate row. Crane had been inside. Samuel's heart struck hard against his ribs. "We hid the ledger." He shouldn't. Eveline lifted the cloth. The ledger Samuel had retrieved was still there, untouched, but Crane had placed something beside it, a single page, ripped from some volume neither of them had ever seen. On it names, dates, and one mark repeated beside several entries, the same broken circle symbol, marked beside people who had disappeared, and at the bottom S.R. Samuel Rivers, his name already written. Already chosen. Eveline's breath caught. No. Samuel stood very still, not afraid, not shocked, just aware. He's not planning to expose what happened here. Samuel said quietly, he's planning to repeat it. The house seemed to constrict around them, air growing thinner, light dimming as clouds slid across the sun. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, slow, heavy, deliberate. Eveline closed the ledger. Samuel stepped forward, not behind her but beside her. Crane entered the doorway. He did not look at the books. He looked only at them. "Well," Crane said softly, "looks like we all understand one another now." Silence. Then he smiled, not with triumph, with certainty. "Let's see who this house chooses." And he turned and walked away, leaving the study heavy with the knowledge that the war between them had already begun. 3 weeks passed since the night James had stood by the river, staring at the moon and whispering promises only the water heard. Winter was slowly creeping in. The wind had become dry, and the fields no longer echoed with summer laughter, only the sound of footsteps dragging through cold soil. Amara worked quietly now, not because she accepted her fate, but because she was waiting, waiting for something she couldn't name, waiting for a miracle that had no shape. One evening, after the day's labor, James found an old writing desk in the abandoned storage shed near the plantation barn. It was dusty, broken along one leg, but inside it were scraps of parchment, unused, untouched. He took one. For the first time in his life, James decided to write a letter, but who would he write to? He didn't know his father's address. He didn't know if the man even lived. He didn't even know where home was for him. Yet his hand moved. He wrote, "If there is a world beyond this, where names and birth and chains mean nothing, then I wish to be seen there, not as property, not as blood of a master, but simply as someone who existed." His handwriting was uneven, unsure, but honest. He continued, "There is a girl here named Amara. Her voice sounds like something that does not want to break, even when everything around her does. If souls are real, then hers is stronger than mine." His hand trembled. He didn't know what he wanted this letter to do. Save him, save her, change the world, no. He only wanted this truth to exist somewhere, even on paper, because on the plantation nothing truly belonged to the enslaved, not even their memories. Amara entered quietly, her footsteps soft. She saw the paper. She didn't ask. She sat beside him. The silence between them was not heavy. It was gentle, like breathing, like two people who no longer needed to explain their pain to one another. James folded the letter, though he had no envelope, no address, no hope of sending it. He placed it inside a crack in the wooden desk, something safe, something secret, something just theirs. Days later, heavy boots walked past the workers' cabins, men with clipped voices, paper in hand. A new order had come from the capital. The plantation was to be inspected, records reviewed, property confirmed, including new births, including children born to enslaved women in recent years. Amara froze. James froze. They didn't speak, but both knew his name would be written down on the list as property, as something that could be sold, moved, separated. Amara's breath became thin. James felt something inside him tighten until it nearly broke. The world did not care about letters hidden in broken desks. The world did not care about promises whispered to rivers. The world came with ink and paper and names and numbers and chains. That night, snow fell for the first time. Amara stood in the doorway of her cabin, arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes melt against the warm wood. She whispered, "Don't disappear." She didn't know if she was speaking to James or to herself, or to the future. James stood behind her. He didn't touch her. He didn't step closer, but his voice was steady. "I won't." The snow kept falling. The world was changing, and soon something irreversible would happen. The kind of change that doesn't ask permission. The kind that tears either chains